knowing how much fabric you need to make a quilt or knowing how much fabric you need for the backing of a quilt are important things to know and very common questions that people ask quilters, but also knowing how much thread you need to have to quilt a quilt is also important. This could be whether you're going to send it to someone else to have the quilting done and you want to provide the thread, maybe because you want to cut down on cost or you want to use a specific type of thread, or maybe you live fairly far away from your fabric store and you want to buy everything you absolutely need to make this quilt, piecing fabric and quilting the quilt all in one-stop shop. So knowing how much thread you need to quilt your quilt depends on the size of quilt you're making. These are some of the standard quilt sizes, everything from a crib quilt all the way up to a king quilt. Now if you just search for common sizes of quilts, you're going to get some variation in the sizes, anywhere from 5 to 8 inches difference on length and width, and it can still be considered a crib versus a lap, throw, or even a twin. So these are some of these standard quilt sizes, including the variations in sizes. So for example, a twin quilt can be anywhere from 70 to 72 by 90 to 95. Going all the way up to a king, it can be anywhere from 110 to 120, and generally that's a large square. So these are the standard quilt sizes. So once you know what size of quilt your quilt falls into, you can then determine how much thread you need to quilt your quilt. So on this page here, I have some general thread requirements in yards, because that is the standard way that a lot of thread is labeled in yards. If you usually work in meters or the thread you have is in meters, you're going to have to convert these numbers. But so these are the amount of yards of thread you need to quilt a quilt. And again, these are the standard sizes of quilts, anywhere from crib all the way up to king. And this here is the amount of quilting you're going to do. Light quilting, quilting only every 3 to 4 inches. Medium quilting every 2 to 3 inches, maybe even down to 1.5 inches. Heavy quilting is going to be within an inch or less, or even into some stipple quilting, so some very, very heavy quilting. So you'll just use this handy guide, and if you are going to make a full-size quilt and you know you're going to do somewhere between medium to light quilting on that quilt, you're going to come down here to full-size quilt, light to medium. You know you're going to need anywhere between 500 to 900 yards of thread. Now that may sound like a lot of thread. You may be thinking, I'm going to need to buy so many spools of thread, but that's going to depend on the size of spool that you buy. So I'm going to push this off to the side here. These are some of the standard sizes of quilt threads that you can find. I have them from very small all the way up to very large, and obviously the amount of thread differs on each one of these spools. So if you're going to do light quilting on a crib quilt, you would need 200 yards of thread. So you could get away with a spool of thread like this. This one happens to have 220 yards of thread on this spool. So that would even give you a little bit of extra in case you do just slightly over light quilting. If you are going to come down here and do a queen size quilt and you want to do heavy quilting, you're going to need 1,600 yards of thread to do your quilting. So you're going to need to pick a larger spool of thread. So anywhere on the spool of thread will always be a label that tells you how much thread is on that thread spool. So again, this one was down here actually printed on the plastic thread spool itself, where on others it's going to be located somewhere on the label that is on your thread. So on this one it has 1,200 yards of thread. So you would need more than one of these if you're going to do heavy quilting on your queen size quilt. So you may want to just jump up to an even larger thread spool like this one that has 3,000 yards of quilting. So now if you look back at your thread requirements and you decide you're going to do maybe heavy quilting on a king size quilt, you could almost do, well, you could do all of that quilting with this one spool of thread because it has 3,000 yards. So just because you see the number and you think that is so much thread, I'm going to need so many thread spools, you definitely want to take a look at how much thread is on each spool of thread, and you want to buy accordingly. So if you're going to do a lot of quilting, definitely buy a larger thread spool rather than having to buy 5 or even 10 of these smaller spools of thread to complete your quilting. So again, to know how much thread you need to quilt your quilt, first decide what size of quilt your quilt is. Again, these are our standard quilt sizes, including some variation for each of them. Determine how much quilting you want to do, light, medium, or heavy, and then use this chart to determine how much thread in yards you're going to need to either quilt your quilt or you're going to need to provide to someone else to quilt your quilt.